So here we are to celebrate 20 years. And I think that we can all agree that the most important thing that happened 20 years ago is that I moved to San Diego and I learned how to surf. Now, okay, maybe it runs a close second to the most important thing, but for me it was transformative, right? I learned a new sport, I learned to love the sport, I learned to respect the ocean, and I learned to share the waves with all of the other surfers who are out there. And in return, the surfing community was incredibly welcoming. Now, I was not the most skilled surfer, I was not entirely coordinated much of the time, but I was trying. And the surfing community has a word for that kind of person. It's called a grommet, or a grom. Now, normally grommets are about 9 years old and get a ride to the beach from mom and dad. But as I said, very welcoming community, and it's very, very cool. Now, at the same time that I was learning to surf, this statue appeared in Cardiff, near some of the well-known surfing breaks. It's called Magic Carpet Ride. And you would have thought that this welcoming community would welcome this artistic expression. Instead, not so much. So what happened? Well, if you ask any surfer what's going on here, they'd look at this and say, well, that doesn't look like surfing, right? That's not what any surfer looks like. If you dive a little bit deeper into the what happened, you discover that the artist never engaged with the surfing community, never embraced these values of loving the sport, of respecting the ocean, of sharing the waves with all of the other surfers. It was almost as if the artist said, hey, surfing is cool, I want to be cool, but didn't want to put in the work. The surfing community has a word for that as well. It's called a kook. And now the statue is known as the kook. So, that's a cool story. How is that relevant to us? Well, over the last 20 years, this topic of design in business has become very cool. And the companies that try to pursue capturing that value of the combination of design and business typically pursue it by using this approach called design thinking. And the design community has something to say about that. Design practitioners, as they are wont to be, were particularly blunt. The academic design community is a little bit more polite in their phrasing, but no less critical. And that's interesting. It's interesting in particular because we actually know that there is a considerable amount of value created through this combination of design and business. In fact, a number of studies over a long period of time, in a number of different markets, in a number of different industries, have shown us that companies that pursue this design-driven approach, using the tools and frameworks and methods of design to compete more effectively, do in fact compete more effectively. They achieve outsized results, about 2-to-1 outperforming their competitors. So how do we reconcile the design community's reaction and this data? How do we reconcile the anecdotal evidence that some companies are able to transform themselves from a non-design-driven company to a design-driven company successfully, and other companies have been unsuccessful when they've attempted this? Well, that's what I and my colleagues study. We've gone out and we've interviewed, dug deep into the inner workings of companies who have made that transformation successfully, companies like SAP and IBM, as well as companies who have been unsuccessful in that transformation. And we've tried to distill some essential learnings. So what have we discovered? Well, we've discovered that this standard model of design thinking, as it's practiced in the wild, fails on two different levels. It fails the organization and it fails the individual. So exactly what does that look like? What are the root causes, the drivers of this? Well, for the individual, it gives them an unworkably incomplete toolkit. Basically, hey, here's the double diamond. Here are the rules for brainstorming. Here are some Post-it notes. Go out there and design. It also deprives the individuals and the teams of the guidance and the expertise of experienced practitioners who have built that understanding over many years, over many projects. And it really encourages them to sort of go it alone, isolate themselves from the rest of the organization, which really sets them up because they also, this classic approach to design thinking, also completely ignores the need for mechanisms that will explicitly bring the organization in to embrace this new way of working and solidify these changes for the ongoing benefit of the organization. Essentially, what the classic model of design thinking as practiced in the wild does, well, it doesn't create design competent business people. It doesn't create capable design teams. It makes design kooks. People who kind of sort of look like designers, who kind of sort of work like designers, but anybody who understands what designers actually do, look closely and say, yeah, that's not design. So what do we do about that? Is there some model that we can pursue that actually reliably will give us the change that we're looking for? My colleagues and I have come up with a model that we call design-driven transformation. I am happy to sit down for the next few hours and discuss this with you in loving detail, but the thing that you really need to take away from this is that it is a process of commitment and collaboration. Senior leadership needs to commit the organization to this design-driven transformation and needs to commit the resources to be able to do so. The frontline designers and design teams need to collaborate with themselves and with the rest of the organization to define the tools and processes that are uniquely effective for that organization in that industry. And then senior leadership needs to commit the organization to actually using those tools. The way that this plays out in the wild, for example, with IBM, in the early days of their design-driven transformation, the CEO promised that any team that wanted to use their new design methods would get free designers, free people on their team. But they had to commit to every single person between that team and the CEO successfully attending their design training and supporting that team as designers. Now, simply saying, hey, these people did this and it seemed to work for them, you should try it too, it's a kind of a sloppy way of thinking. We went out and tested this. We've tested this with a number of organizations that you wouldn't think of as design organizations, helped them through lengthy design-driven transformations, and so far the evidence seems to be that this process works. Now, organizationally, that's an interesting story. Individually, what do we do to more effectively train our business people to work in this kind of design-driven fashion? Well, early on, in the early days of the academic study of design, Nigel Cross and some of his colleagues came up with this, well, had this recognition that designers, successful designers, tend to work in kind of unique ways. And they labeled them these designerly ways of knowing and doing, and eventually these designerly ways of thinking, not design thinking. If you dive in and ask yourself, okay, what are these designerly ways of knowing and doing and thinking? It's this experimentalist approach. Framing and reframing, coming up with hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, and changing your approach based on what you've learned. There's another name for this. It's called the scientific method. Okay, wouldn't it be cool if somebody were to actually test whether teaching people this approach in a business context was effective? So, in a cohort of 116 participants in an incubator in Milan, they were divided into two groups. One group was taught classic entrepreneurship. Move fast and break things. Stay true to your vision. Henry Ford never bothered to ask his customers what they want. The other half was taught this scientific method approach to entrepreneurship, which we now understand really to be design-driven entrepreneurship. Now, this is very cool research. I need to point out that this is not my work. It is the work of colleagues at the Politecnico di Milano, and I am insanely jealous of what they have done. What did they discover? Well, A certain number of people just abandoned the study. We don't know where they went. Maybe they inherited €1 million from a long-lost aunt, and entrepreneurship is hard. They went away. Of the people who remained, about a third of the people trained in classical entrepreneurship made a significant pivot, discovered that their idea wasn't all that great, they changed. That's about what we see in Silicon Valley entrepreneurship teams too, by the way. The design-driven entrepreneurs changed fundamentally their idea at about twice the rate of the classically trained entrepreneurs. It becomes even more interesting when we look at the follow-on change. The design-driven entrepreneurs continued to change, whereas the classic entrepreneurs just kind of stuck with either their first or second idea. This pivoting, one of these design-driven entrepreneurship teams actually pivoted 4 times. Well, that's great, that's interesting. Were they successful? If we define success as revenue generation, it looks like they were kind of equally successful. If we define success as the amount of revenue generated, we see that the design-driven teams on average achieved more than 8 times the revenue of the classic entrepreneurs. This was over a very short period of time, by the way, about a year. And you may look at this and say, well, great. Maybe we've got an outlier out there that's skewing the results for the design-driven entrepreneurs. In fact, no. All across the board, the design-driven entrepreneurs outperformed the classically trained entrepreneurs about 3 to 1. So this is a very cool story, some very cool research. What does that mean for us? Well, this sort of evidence-driven approach informs our curriculum. It informed the transformation of Management 412, which many of you remember fondly, from business model and opportunity analysis, identification and analysis, into new venture design. So if you are a current Rady student or recent Rady student, you are benefiting from this evidence-based approach to curriculum design because you are learning at the cutting edge of practice. If you are an alumnus farther out, you're benefiting from the continuing reputation of Rady at teaching at the leading edge of entrepreneurship, number 2 in entrepreneurship. If you are a member of the surrounding business community, you're benefiting by welcoming our bright, well-educated graduates into your organizations. And so I welcome all of you to not be a design kook, but join me in this designerly way of doing business. Thank you. Thank you.